Today, I'm not going to encourage you. Instead, I'm going to produce evidence that will demonstrate just how important you really are. During the next 20 minutes, I'll provide definitive proof about exactly how much your life matters, not just to your family and friends, but to all of us, and for all time. Some years ago, I came to an unusual conclusion about communication. Simply put, it's this: encouragement is temporary, but proof lasts forever. Why was that important? Because it changed my content, and it changed how I delivered that content. While encouragement is usually welcome, it always comes with a statute of limitations. You can be encouraged until the first crazy thing happens in your life, or you can be encouraged until Monday, as long as I encourage you late on a Friday. On the other hand, proof stands the test of time. Now, I'm not referring to a mathematical proof. I'm talking about proof beyond a reasonable doubt. The kind of proof where you hear something you haven't heard before, or in a way you haven't heard it presented, and your reaction is, I never thought of that. I don't guess I'll ever think of it any other way again. See, that's proof beyond a reasonable doubt, and it lasts because it doesn't rely upon your emotion or my tone of voice. Of course, any form of proof must align with truth, because at any moment in the future you begin to examine what you've learned and doubt that it's the truth, it's no longer proof. The truth is like the bottom of the pool. It's foundational. In a pool, you can't go deeper than the bottom, and you can't go deeper concerning a subject than the truth. Despite what some believe, the truth about most things is not large. That's why great truths cannot be grasped from a 30,000-foot view. One finds incontrovertible truths by narrowing to a point. Truth, at least explainable truth, can be found in the little things. For instance, don't sweat the small stuff is an example of what is called conventional wisdom. However, if you'd like your life to turn out any better than humanity's average, you'd be smart to understand that sometimes conventional wisdom is not even the truth. Or in other words, it's time to sweat the small stuff. There are those who claim to be big picture people, and their descriptions of future results are often grand and exciting. But big plans have to include a definitive concept of all the little things that must be factored in, delegated, worked out, and completed in order for the big picture to actually come together. In other words, while it's critical to have a vision, it's foolish to ignore the fact that every big picture ever completed was created by tiny individual brushstrokes that were applied one at a time. One of the greatest big pictures in history hangs in the Louvre. When Leonardo da Vinci painted the Mona Lisa, he chose to work with the smallest brush he had ever used. The pressure he applied with that brush was so delicate and the movements of its tip so slight that today, even with a magnifying glass, you can't discern the individual brush strokes. Yet they were obviously applied one at a time, carefully, and with loving attention. Why? Because Da Vinci was creating a masterpiece. What are you creating? To what or whom are you paying close attention as you build your life? However your family turns out, whatever happens with your business career, your organization, or your team, at the end of it all, whether you have produced a disaster or a masterpiece, it will have been created one small brushstroke at a time. So sweat the small stuff. Seriously. Even the incredibly small, seemingly insignificant stuff, like the single flap of a butterfly's wing. In 1963, Edward Lorenz presented a hypothesis to the New York Academy of Science. His theory, stated simply, was that a butterfly could flap its wings and set molecules of air in motion which would move other molecules of air, in turn moving more molecules of air that would eventually be capable of starting a hurricane on the other side of the planet. Lorenz and his ideas were literally laughed out of the conference. What he had proposed was ridiculous. It was preposterous, but it was interesting. Therefore, because of the idea's charm and intrigue, the butterfly effect became a staple of science fiction, and the idea hung around for decades in myth and urban legend and comic books and bad movies. So imagine the scientific community's shock and surprise when more than 30 years after the possibility was introduced, physics professors working from colleges and universities worldwide came to the conclusion that the butterfly effect was authentic, accurate, and viable. Soon after, it was accorded the status of a law, just like the law of gravity. The butterfly effect is now known in scientific circles as the law of sensitive dependence upon initial conditions. And this principle has proven to be a force that encompasses more than just butterfly wings. Science has shown the butterfly effect to engage with the first movement of any form of matter, including people. This means that every move you make, every action you take, matters. Not just to you or your family or your business or hometown. Everything you do matters to all of us forever. So how does the butterfly effect work in real life? Consider this. On Friday, April 2nd, 2004, ABC News honored a man who at that time was 91 years old. The news program was running this regular Friday segment called Person of the Week. And usually the honoree's accomplishments are listed in advance, and by the time the name is announced, most folks have already guessed the identity of that week's recipient. In this instance, however, the reveal left a lot of viewers very puzzled. So the anchorman finally said, and so our person of the week is Norman Borlaug. I mean, you can imagine the frowns, right? Who did he say? Norman? What was the last name? Despite our being unfamiliar with the name, Norman Borlaug was a man personally responsible for drastically and dramatically changing the world in which we live. You see, in the early 1940s, Norman Borlaug hybridized high-yield, disease-resistant corn and wheat for arid climates. So from the Dust Bowl of Western Africa to our own desert Southwest, from South and Central America to the plains of Siberia, across Europe and Asia, Borlaug's specific seed product flourished and regenerated where no seed had ever thrived before. Through the years, it's now been calculated that Norman Borlaug's work saved from famine more than 2 billion lives. Think about that. The guy saved 2 billion lives. And for that, he was Person of the Week. Actually, it was never reported, but the anchorman was misinformed. It wasn't really Norman Borlaug who saved the 2 billion people, though very few caught the mistake. It was a man named Henry Wallace. Henry Wallace was the vice president of the United States under Franklin Roosevelt. Now, wait a minute. People say, I thought Harry Truman was vice president under Roosevelt. Well, he was, but remember, Roosevelt served 4 terms. He was elected 4 times. And curiously, had 3 different vice presidents. Truman was the 3rd. But the second man to serve as Roosevelt's vice president was Henry Wallace. Wallace was the former Secretary of Agriculture who, after his 1 term as vice president, was dumped from the ticket in favor of Truman. But while Wallace was vice president, he used the power of that office to create a station in Mexico whose sole purpose was to hybridize corn and wheat for arid climates. And he hired a young man named Norman Borlaug to run it. So Norman Borlaug won the Nobel Prize. And Norman Borlaug was given the Presidential Medal of Freedom, and Norman Borlaug got Person of the Week. But considering how it really happened, it was Henry Wallace that saved the 2 billion people, right? Unless it would have been George Washington Carver. You remember Carver, don't you? The peanut? But here's something very few people know. When Carver was 19 years old and a student at Iowa State University, he had a dairy sciences professor who on Saturday and Sunday afternoons would allow his 6-year-old boy to go on botanical expeditions with this brilliant student. I mean, Carver was basically the kid's babysitter. But it was George Washington Carver who took that boy and instilled in him a love for plants and a vision for what they could do for humanity. It was George Washington Carver who pointed the 6-year-old Henry Wallace's life in a specific direction long before he ever thought about being vice president of the United States. It's amazing to think about, isn't it? George Washington Carver flapping his butterfly wings with the peanut. There's 266 things he developed from the peanut that we still use today. He flapped his wings for years with the sweet potato. 88 things Carver developed from the sweet potato that we still use today. And while no one was even looking, George Washington Carver flapped his wings a couple of times with a 6-year-old boy and just happened to save the lives of more than 2 billion people and counting. So maybe George Washington Carver should have been Person of the Week. Unless it could have been the farmer from Diamond, Missouri. His name was Moses. He lived in a slave state, but he didn't believe in slavery. So this was a problem for psychopaths like Quantrill's raiders who terrorized the area, destroying property, burning and killing. And sure enough, one January night, Quantrill's raiders rode through Moses' farm and they burned the barn. They shot several people and they dragged off a lady named Mary Washington who refused to let go of her infant son, George. Now, Moses had a wife named Susan. And while Moses was probably ADD, kind of crazy like me, Susan was a calm organizer. And Mary Washington was Susan's best friend. Therefore, it was Susan who sent messages and messengers, getting the word out through neighbors and towns, trying desperately to arrange a meeting with Quantrill's raiders, hoping beyond hope to get Mary and her baby back. And 2 days later, she had the meeting set. So Susan sent her husband several hours north to a crossroads in Kansas. He rode a black horse. And there at the appointed time in the middle of this cold January night, he met 4 of Quantrill's raiders. They were on horseback, carrying torches, flour sacks over their head with the holes cut out for their eyes. And there Moses traded the only horse he had left on his farm for what they threw him in a burlap sack. And as they thundered off on their horses, Moses fell to his knees and there, alone in that dark winter night, with his breath coming out against that black night, he pulled from the bag a cold, naked, almost dead baby boy. He jerked open his coat and his shirts, and he put this child next to his skin and covered him up. Then Moses turned toward home and walked that baby out. Moses walked through the night and into the next morning. And finally, the following afternoon, when he finally stumbled through the door at home, he placed the baby in the arms of his wife, and they put him on a blanket near the fireplace and began to rub his arms and legs, just get his circulation going, get him to cry something. And they prayed over that child right then and promised God that if he'd let that baby live, they would raise him as their own. They promised the baby they would see to it that he was educated, to honor his mother, who they knew was already dead. And that was the moment they gave that baby their name. And that's how Moses and Susan Carver came to raise that little baby, George Washington. So when you think about it, maybe it was a farmer's wife from Diamond, Missouri, who saved the 2 billion people. Unless, is there an ending to this story? Not really. Because when you think about it, who was it that saved the 2 billion lives? Is there a specific person to whom we could point? How far back would we have to go? How many lives would we need to examine in order to determine who it really was whose action saved 2 billion people, a number that continues to increase every moment? And how far forward would we need to go in your life to show the difference you make? You understand, right? There are generations yet unborn whose very lives will be shifted and shaped by the moves you make and the actions you take today and tomorrow and the next day and the next. Every single thing you do matters. You've been created as one of a kind. On the planet Earth, there has never been one like you, and there never will be again. Your spirit, your thoughts and feelings, your ability to reason and act, all exist in no one else. The rarities that make you special are not an accident or a quirk of fate. You've been created in order that you might make a difference. You have within you the power to change the world. Know that your actions can't be hoarded. They can't be saved for later or used selectively. By your hand, millions, billions of lives will be altered, caught up in a chain of events begun by you this day. The very beating of your heart has meaning and purpose. Your actions have value far greater than silver or gold. Your life and what you do with it today matters forever.